your job is killing you. Deepa, did you hear what I said? Your job is killing you. Dr. Heather was my 14th doctor, and the last one I saw before I got my official Lyme diagnosis. As she spread my reports across her desk, I felt myself getting smaller in my body. We can run a lot more tests, or I can tell you what you already know. You have a big job. You travel all the time. You're stressed out. Your job is not letting you heal. And then she asked me 3 life-changing questions. Do you feel like you have to have a big job like this to feel worthy? What would you do if you didn't do this job? And do you see that there's value in just being you? At that point, I felt myself get hot in my body, and not because what she said was wrong or because I was angry, but because what she said was so right. She had put her finger in the middle of a really tender point for me. I lived to work. I wasn't working to live. And I didn't know why. I left Dr. Heather's office that day and I went back to my hotel room and I started writing my work obituary because I thought my life was ending, my identity was ending. And that would eventually be, my work obituary would be the letter that I would send to my boss to end my 20-year career. But I didn't quit right away. It took me quite a long time to leave. And yes, some of it had to do with what else would I do with my life and how would I make money, the questions everyone asks. But some of it had to do with much bigger questions. Who was I? I was known for producing and performing. I couldn't figure out what I would do if I wasn't doing those things. And then there was a bigger issue for me. I was one of the first and one of the only women of color at the table. I felt so responsible to the women of color coming up after me and around me. I felt like I was failing them, and I felt like I was failing myself. Now today, we're in the middle of COVID, and everyone is in the great reckoning where everyone is asking what they should do with their lives and their work, the great resignation. But when I was going through it, I felt very alone. McKinsey now says that 1 in 3 women is leaving the workforce. I was looking for answers on stay or go, and so I started gathering women of color. It started in person, and as things progressed, it turned into Zoom and conference calls. And 25 conversations in, I saw what I thought was an interesting coincidence. 100 conversations in, I saw a pattern. And now, having spoken to over 1,000 women of color, I see an epidemic. The women of color I met were in seats of power, but they weren't feeling powerful. In fact, they were questioning why they'd given up so much to get to the seat. And many of them were as sick as I was. I wanted to understand it, I wanted to study it for myself, but also for others. And so I have. It's become my purpose and my calling. I now help women of color find their power. And what I learned in those conversations early on is so much of why we don't feel powerful has to do with the fact, the stories and the messages that we're given. From early childhood, from our parents, from school, from society, we are told that power and success looks like something else. We are told it doesn't look like us. And when you get that message over and over and over again, it starts to erase who you are. And there is a lot we do in our society to erase the experience of women of color. We erase where we come from, we erase what we think, we erase our stories, we erase who we are. And we need to change that. We need to reclaim that. That is how we find our power. I call this shedding and carrying. I think we need to shed messages that don't serve us and carry forward messages that do. So I said I met with a lot of women of color, and I've seen some of the messages that come up over and over again. There are 4 that I have found most common that we need to shed as women of color. The first is that we need to work harder to get half as far, because that sets us up for a lifetime of overworking and exhausting ourselves. The second is that once we get to the table, we should be happy and thankful that we got there, because then you don't use your full voice. The third, and this happens with a lot of immigrant women, is that you shouldn't rock the boat or bring attention to yourself because attention is bad. And we need to change that, because if you don't rock the boat, you're not going to change the status quo. And finally, and this applies to all women, we are all taught there's maybe one, sometimes a few, but usually one seat at the table. And we all have to fight for it. Those are messages we have to shed. They don't serve us, they don't belong to us, and we need to give them back. And maybe even more important than what we shed is what we carry. The messages we replace those messages with. There were also a few that I saw, patterns, in the women of color I met. And those were, we need to remember where we come from. Our families, our history, our lineage matters. And there is real wisdom in our cultures. And we don't have to leave it behind. We can carry it with us. The second is, we live in a society that tells us that we should lead and think with our heads, not with our guts or our intuition or our heart. And we need to carry forward that we can lead in other ways. Because it's so important to do it differently. And third, we need to remember that we also come from cultures where success wasn't just individual. Success was also about community success. And I want us to carry that forward because that's how we truly make change and take others with us. So again, it's so important what we shed and so important what we carry forward. I want you to think back to primary school. So when I was in first and second grade, and I'm going to date myself now, they would roll out the video cart and put in a cassette because there was one VCR shared like in the whole hall. Some of you may remember that, some of you won't, because now you have iPads and all kinds of cool ways you watch videos. But in my day, they'd put in the cassette, and I remember the videos on time-lapse plants, right, where the plants would be growing. And you would see all this time spent on the stems and how the plants were going up to the sky and the sun, and the leaves were opening up. There was very little time spent below the soil on the roots. And it's the same message. It's so much more important, I think, to focus on the roots, because the roots are where the wisdom lies. The roots are where the plant gets its nutrients, and the roots are how it survives in toxic environments. And the same is true for women of color. The women I met who know this, who embody this, are fearless, are so powerful in their own right. And not because they have, found something and they're emulating something, but because they have found themselves. And that kind of power is unstoppable. These women live in alignment. How they work is how they show up in their lives, is how they show up with their families. And when something happens to them, when the system doesn't show up correctly, they don't meet the system with the system. They show up as themselves, and that is so powerful, and what I want us to all find. So how do you find this? How do you do this? Well, most of the women of color I met kind of step into this when some big life event happens, when the system shows up in some way that is so egregious that they have no ability to do anything else but to ask big questions about why and how do they change it. For me, that happened when I got sick and spent 8 months in bed and had Dr. Heather ask me some really big questions about my life. It made me really ask, do I want to live to work? Do I want to ask different questions about myself, and how do I want to show up? So if you find yourself in a big life event where something has just happened to you, ask yourself, how do you want to show up? What do you want to do? But if you're not finding yourself in a life event, maybe it's just COVID. Maybe COVID is making you ask different questions about the space that work takes up in your life or how you want to lead. You can just really get still with yourself. This is about asking yourself who you want to be and how you want to be. It's about walking and being in nature and journaling and seeing what comes up. Because most of us have 5 or 6 messages that come up for us when we get into difficult situations, and those come from childhood. They come from our parents. And if we don't reprogram those, that we're not enough or we need to do more, we shouldn't do this, those messages take over our lives. And we need to shed those messages and replace them with ones that we want. This type of leadership, it is so different. It's about leading with knowing who you are and what you believe from the inside. I think it's a new kind of leadership. And it's a leadership that we need right now, because we're in a moment in time where what got us here is not going to get us there. This kind of leadership doesn't ask you to sacrifice who you are or what you believe. It doesn't ask you to give up your health or your mental wellness. It doesn't ask you to give up your family to do your job. This kind of leadership is about knowing yourself and leading with that. And think about the world we could create if we gave ourselves permission to trust ourselves, permission to question things around us, and permission to show up differently. This is our moment to change. And for women of color, I believe this kind of leadership is how we step into our legacy and our leadership. So I ask you now, what are you willing to shed? And what are you willing to carry forward as you step forward in these next moments? Thank you.